And one. And, well, it's the broadcast, and welcome Rich Rubino. Today we're going to talk about Henry Kissinger. And if you're my age, Henry Kissinger's been a fixture for quite some time. Well, not recently, but for a long time, he had a lot of influence. And I guess even in his 100th year, met with China. So pretty influential. I need to right away introduce Rich Rubino, who is an insanely knowledgeable political historian, crazy. If he knows the details that no one else knows, and he's good at sharing them. He's a very professional guy, and I'm lucky to have him. And of course, when it comes to politics, you have Henry Kissinger, big deal, right? So you've talked about Henry Kissinger a lot, but give me the good, the bad, and the ugly, and do it like you want. You can set it up as you wish.
Okay. Essentially, when you talk about the Henry Kissinger legacy, one word comes to mind: bifurcated. What does that mean? You hear a lot from basically positive and negative about Henry Kissinger. On the positive side, I think that it was the Cold War. I think, for example, his back channels to the Chinese afforded Richard Nixon going to China. You often hear the expression, "the Nixon goes to China." Why is that so? Why is that so interesting? In part because Nixon was always an anti-communist. If you go back to his time, for example, when he ran for a United States Senate seat back in 1950, he called his opponent Helen Gahagan Douglas the Red Lady. So he was always an ardent communist. He went after Alger Hiss, for example. That's what he really made his political name as the face card of the anti-communist movement. But Kissinger knew that there was an opening between the United States and China, and he worked with China. And eventually, Nixon went, and he actually went, met with Mao Zedong. That led the way for 1979 when President Jimmy Carter normalized relations with China. So that's certainly part of it. When it really comes down, and the other part is certainly the Russians working for example, détente and strategic arms limitation treaty. When it comes down to it, though, there's one word that comes to my mind. You probably heard this in the press, and that's realpolitik. And what does that mean? It's basically a Machiavellian view of the human existence. Essentially, you don't care when you deal with other countries, you do not care whether they're democracies, constitutional republics, whether they're autocracies. Joe Biden, for example, talks about democracy beating autocracies. He's had two summits of the America of democracies, for example. George W. Bush, in his 2005 inauguration address, said that the goal of the U.S. ultimately should be to end tyranny in our world. Kissinger did not believe that. Kissinger, everything was about self-interest. Just said, very Machiavellian. Everything was transactional. And what does that mean? Essentially, on the big scale, you have the United States, China, and Russia. It's all about the Cold War. And what does that mean for smaller countries? That means essentially that we don't care about their human rights abuses. The United States does not care what their policies are internally. It's just essentially about how this will benefit us.
Right.
Now, here's what's interesting, though, because you hear all the time, you're going to hear this a lot. Folks like Amy Goodman, you're going to say, or Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens said he's a war criminal. Now, why? Well, first of all, when he was secretary, he was national security advisor in the Nixon administration. Then he becomes secretary of state, the second Nixon administration, and serves to the end of the Ford administration. There were a couple of things. One of them was during the Vietnam War. He worked to expand the war into Cambodia because they were providing supply lines to the North Vietnamese. Hundreds of thousands of people ended up dying. The other one, there were a bunch of others. In September 11th, 1973, they call it their September 11th, for example, in Chile. Kissinger was very much involved in trying to effectuate a coup against the leftist leader Salvador Allende. And Pinochet, who was very much an autocrat, one of those truculent dictators of all time, takes over. East Timor in 1975, President Ford and Henry Kissinger were coming back to the United States from the trip to Beijing. And they met with Suharto, who was very much a U.S. ally, very oppressive, but someone who was very anti-communist. And he told them essentially that he wanted to invade East Timor. And Kissinger and Ford basically gave him the green light and said, well, we understand what you have to do, but just don't do it while we're here. So the next day he ended up invading, and that was certainly a humanitarian tragedy. That's why you hear essentially on both sides. On the one hand, you have people who say he was a great diplomat. He worked to bring peace between the great nations. And on the other side, people who say that he was a war criminal and that he essentially is responsible for hundreds of thousands, even in some cases up to 3 million deaths, from a very liberal estimate of it.
Back to realpolitik. Basically, we don't try to change you, even though you're an evil empire.
Yeah.
You do you, as long as our as long as we work together to our benefit, not our mutual benefit. As long as we're happy with the deal, we don't care what kind of murdering SOBs you guys are. We'll let you be you, no matter what. Is that in the long run? Is that a good way to be? Does that come back to harm you in the end? Like now in
Yeah.
Ukraine?
Well, yes, and because there's a term. It goes back to 1953. It's called blowback. What does blowback mean? Well, in 1953, the Eisenhower administration in the United States and the Churchill administration in Great Britain, essentially, there was a democratically elected leader in Iran named Mohammad Mossadegh. So he was actually elected democratically, and he tried to nationalize the oil fields. He was a leftist leader. So first Churchill and the CIA tried to convince President Truman, outgoing President Truman in 1952, that he should sponsor a coup to essentially take him out of power. Truman decided not to do this. Eisenhower agreed to do it. And essentially, so what happened? So this is all about realpolitik. They said, we want somebody who's going to be an anti-communist. We want someone that's going to benefit us, somebody who's not going to nationalize the oil field, someone that can bring oil prices down. So who do they put in? They put the Shah of Iran in. They installed the Shah of Iran. Shah of Iran, very autocratic leader. He had his secret police essentially beating people. And what happens in there? In 1979, there's a coup by the essentially by the Shia Muslims led by the Ayatollah Khomeini, and they end up taking hostages, and this is where the hostage crisis essentially emanates from, and that was realpolitik. Yes,
I need to interject here. So you don't even have to wait for blowback. I mean, really, if you install a bad guy like the Shah of Iran, immediately we become the bad guy too.
yes,
And so you don't have to wait for any time for blowback. There's an automatic. If you put that guy in there, you become the bad guy. That's interesting. I mean, you mentioned Churchill, by the way. A side note: the more I hear about Churchill, I mean, most of us only know about this is our darkest hour and his strength and getting them through World War II.
Right.
But he did a lot of, I would say, unsavory stuff. I mean, at least by today's standards. I don't want to get into it, but
right, and certainly he, just like Kissinger, he also has very much a bifurcated legacy. On the one side hand, he's one of the few leaders who saw the threat that Hitler posed in the 1930s. But on the other hand, if you ask people in much of the country, for example, in India, for example, in Kenya, they would have a very negative view of Winston Churchill.
So why don't you run through some key career points for Kissinger?
Okay, so Kissinger, what he was not in a respect is an ideologue. Lots of times people will run for political office because they have a certain set of ideals that they want. Then there are those who are just kind of survivalists or accommodationists who are basically there, and sometimes they go from administration to administration. They're not necessarily partisan or ideological, but they want to be part of the power structure.
And then
there was that.
Let me interject. Sometimes there's somebody that pretends to be an ideologue, and they ain't.
Yes,
moving on. I think you know who I'm talking about.
You see that you see that once in a while as well. Somebody will gravitate from one side to another, for example, or they will. Well, here's an example of that, and I'll give you another example of that. Would be Mitt Romney in many respects. When Mitt Romney in 1992, he voted, and this later came out when he ran for president. He voted in the Democratic primary, and he voted for Paul Tsongas in the Massachusetts primary that year. Later, Newt Gingrich brought this up in 2012 when he was running against him, and Mitt Romney asseverated essentially, well, I thought that Paul Tsongas was I thought Bill Clinton was the biggest threat to the country, and Paul Tsongas was opposing him. That's why I voted for Paul Tsongas. But at the time, Massachusetts was overwhelmingly for Paul Tsongas. Paul Tsongas won overwhelmingly. The campaign was not contested, and there was actually a contest on the other side between Pat Buchanan and George H.W. Bush. So 2 years later, he runs for United States Senate, runs against a guy named venture capitalist named John Lakian, who is very much very similar profile to him, actually outspent him. Romney ends up winning the nomination, and in the United States, and when he runs against Ted Kennedy, he says, when Ted Kennedy tried to say you're very similar to Reagan Bush, he says, I'm not running to support Reagan Bush. He says the R in Republican stands for reform. So very much a moderate. 2002, he comes back after losing, runs for governor. Essentially the same thing. He called himself 2 days before Allison King was interviewing. He called himself a progressive type of a guy. So he becomes governor. In the first 2 years, he was relatively moderate. Thinking about running for president, the second 2 years, he moves to the right, whether it was his changing positions on abortion, his opposition to stem cell research, leading the movement, for example, against gay marriage in 2004. He was out there saying, let the people vote, basically saying if they should vote, they should be allowed to vote. But he was against the idea of gay marriage. He testified before the United States Senate against the idea. And then, so his second 2 years, he really moves far to the right. And he runs for president in 2008 as basically the conservative alternative to John McCain. 2012, again, he runs as a conservative alternative, talks about self-deportation for illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants, depending on your profile. Donald Trump criticizes him, says he's too far to the right. Then what happens later in life? Mitt Romney runs for a Senate seat in Utah, and in many respects, he went back to where he was prior to becoming governor of Massachusetts, at least in the second 2 years as governor of Massachusetts, and becomes the only person in the first time in the United States Senate, the first impeachment, to vote for the impeachment of Donald Trump. And now he suggests that many Democrats might be better than Republicans. This is somebody who I think wants to be in public service, perhaps admirably, but is not there for a set of ideological principles. He's there because he wants to be. He's there because he sees how he can change something from point A to point B, and he's willing to change. Another example would be Al Gore. Al Gore, when he was in the United States Senate from 10, he gets reelected very much against abortion rights in the House of Representatives, the United States Senate. He talks about homosexuality being essentially being abnormal behavior. Many in the religious right in 1988 support his presidential candidacy. He calls himself a Democrat you can vote for, runs to the right of every other Democrat, talks in every other candidate, Dick Gephardt, Jesse Jackson, were basically saying that he's running as a Republican. He's very much a Southern strategy that year. Shows off the fact that he's a tobacco farmer when he runs for president, when he campaigns in North Carolina, wins basically only Southern states that year. And then 1992, he eventually becomes Bill Clinton's running mate. Bill Clinton's trying to look for a moderate, and he finds a moderate that's very similar in a profile of Bill Clinton. He also, by the way, voted for the Gulf War. Then, after the Clinton administration, he becomes an ardent opponent of the Iraq War, decides he supports universal health care, he supports single-payer health care, global warming, which was somewhat in the back burner when he was vice president, certainly in his presidential campaign, becomes his flagship issue. So he's somebody who kind of went the opposite way of Mitt Romney. But there are people who just come with their ideological principles and rarely deviate from them. Matt Gaetz is certainly one of them on the right. I think AOC on the left is probably another one.
Okay, and Kissinger was not an ideologue. Let's get back to some key career points in Kissinger's life.
Interestingly, so as I said, he was not an ideologue, and in fact, he had many ties and worked toward with the Johnson administration. Late in the administration, Johnson was a very liberal Democrat. The Johnson-Humphrey administration, when they were trying to negotiate a treaty they were trying to negotiate an end to the Vietnam War, and President Johnson. This was late in 1968. President Johnson wanted the North Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese, and the United States all to agree to at least to meet. And the South Vietnamese under President Tu originally agreed that they would meet with both the North Vietnamese and the United States, respectively. Henry Kissinger then using back channels, basically sent a message to President Nixon, former Vice President Richard Nixon, the Republican presidential nominee, explaining what was going on and explaining the details. And what did Nixon do? Nixon sent Anne Chennault, who was an emissary of somebody who was very much a benefactor of the Republican Party, to go to President Tu, and President Tu said, you can get a better deal when Richard M. Nixon gets elected president. So what does President Tu do? He vows out of the talks, and Nixon barely beats Hubert Humphrey by less than 1 percentage point. Now, had President Tu been there, would they have actually negotiated a deal? It's questionable. It's one of those things in history no one will ever know about. But the fact is that Kissinger saw Nixon as somebody he wanted to be an ally with. So he leaked that information to Nixon. And then what happens? Richard Nixon does become president, and Henry Kissinger becomes his national security advisor. Then even though Kissinger was very much what Nixon loathed, he was very much an academician, he was very much an intellectual, and Nixon always saw himself as kind of more of a common man. But they essentially worked together and had a very interesting alliance. As you go closer to the 1972 presidential campaign, Kissinger's talking about Vietnam, said peace is at hand. Eventually, on January 22nd of 1973, there was a peace treaty between the United States and North Vietnam. And what happened 2 years later, of course, in 1975, was you had the fall of Saigon. but Nixon basically was one of the co-winners of the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to end the Vietnam War. Now, critics will say he could have gotten the same agreement he got in 1973. He could have essentially gotten that same deal if he had done it the first day in 1969, or President Johnson and President Tu had made, and the North Vietnamese had made a deal in 1968, and essentially Vietnam did fall at the end. So he stays on in the administration, and interestingly, in 1975, and this is really an inflection point in conservatism in the United States. So Gerald R. Ford succeeds Richard Nixon. And remember Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Soviet dissident, comes to the United States, wrote the book The Gulag Archipelago, and basically withstood torture under the Russian regime. And he comes to the United States and wants to meet with President Ford. And Kissinger says, don't meet with Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Why? Because Kissinger, Nixon, and then Ford were all advocates of the détente policy, meaning relaxation of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. And if you're relaxing tensions, the last thing you want is someone who's a dissident, who's a critic of your regime. So Ford does not meet with Solzhenitsyn. His official explanation was, I don't meet with individual citizens from other countries, although he did meet with Pele. So I'll just end with this. Ronald Reagan, former governor of California, finds out about this. He was running a column at the time, wrote a column excoriated him, and basically uses that as the impetus or the casus belli or the cause célèbre for his presidential campaign in 1976 by saying essentially, we need to take on the Soviet Union. We don't need the détente policies of Henry Kissinger.
That is interesting. What is would you say is Kissinger's most infamous act? The big knock on Henry Kissinger.
I would say it's arguable, but the first thing would be certainly expanding the war to Cambodia, arguably constitutionally impermissible, because there wasn't a declaration of war, but there's an authorization of war. And going back to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, President Johnson won back in 1964 with unanimous support in the House and only 2 dissenting votes in the United States Senate. He expanded into Cambodia under the auspices of the Cambodians were supplying supply lines for the North Vietnamese. This led to a complete genocide, essentially, in Cambodia. That was part of it. And it's threefold. The other was 1973, when they took out the democratically elected leader and installed a dictator in the country of Chile. And the other was East Timor, when President Ford and Henry Kissinger, on the last leg coming back from China, met with him, and basically some on the left say that they gave him the green light to go in and to invade East Timor the next day, which led to a very bloody conflict there. So those were, I think, the 3 main knocks on him.
You mentioned the Gulf of Tonkin and that incident, which was justification for the war. Is that something that Kissinger would have been involved in cooking up?
I don't think he was involved in cooking up. This was very non-controversial at the time. So in 1964, Johnson basically asked for a blank check of the Gulf of Tonkin, and every solitary member of think of this, it was 416 because not everyone was there, to 0 House members, the most liberal to most conservative members, voted for that. In the United States Senate, only Senator Ernest Gruning from Alaska and Wayne Morris from Oregon voted against it. It was extremely popular. Going into Vietnam.
How can you remember that anyway? That's crazy.
Because there's nothing else in my membrane, I think.
Okay. I don't want to get too far away from the Gulf of Tonkin. We didn't really explain what it was. Can you explain what it was?
Yes. So basically in 1964, and President Johnson at the time was saying that we will not send United States troops, our boys, to defend a country that the North Vietnamese boys should be defending themselves. But there was an attack, and the first attack it was a mistake by the North Vietnamese on a ship at the Gulf of Tonkin, and then there was another attack that there's some question. President Johnson was on a telephone call with Richard Russell, for example, his mentor, Democratic senator from Georgia, conservative Democrat, saying he didn't think potentially that they didn't know whether it actually happened. But this gave him impetus, saying essentially we were attacked, so I need a blank check so I can retaliate.
I was under the impression that it was kind of decided that was a setup, a fake thing.
The second one, yes. The first one, something probably happened there was some sort of a conflict by mistake, but it certainly was not something most people think warranted going into war in Vietnam.
Okay. Back to Henry. Now, what about high points?
High points has to be the Cold War, and certainly his back channels going into China. The most interesting thing is only Richard Nixon is probably the only person who could actually have gone to China and gotten away with it, specifically with his conservative base. Conservatives in the United States at the time were ardently anti-communist. They did not think you should, under any circumstances, deal with the Chinese. Kissinger saw a different opening because he's not necessarily an ideologue, he's a pragmatist. And he said, just because the Soviet Union and the Chinese are communists doesn't mean they have the same interests. Essentially, what does not matter what type of regime we have, what type of regime they have. And this is why, for example, he would deal with these truculent dictators in Indonesia, because they were anti-communists, we're anti-communists. It's kind of like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. No matter what they do internally, we're going to forgive anything they do internally. In the case of China, I mean, Mao Zedong was arguably the biggest killer of his century. But from a strategic interest, the United States needed to have a relationship with China. President Nixon goes there, and what happens? We do have a relationship with China, and that's the biggest legacy. The other legacy in terms of the Russians, in terms of détente, the Cold War presidents Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson all wanted a confrontational view of the Cold War towards the Soviet Union. Nixon did not want that, and Kissinger basically said we need to relax tensions between the two. So Leonid Brezhnev and Richard Nixon had a relationship. Ford and Brezhnev had a relationship. They met at Vladimir, for example. He eased the relations. Jimmy Carter continued that policy, and what really put this to a halt, though, was in 1980. In 1980, Russia invaded Afghanistan, and then Jimmy Carter basically said, I've learned a lot about the Russians, and then he asked for a huge defense increase in defense spending and got it from the Congress in 1980. And then Ronald Reagan came in and had a confrontational view to the Soviet Union until his second term, when he started actually to meet with Gorbachev. And when he met with Gorbachev, folks in the right wing of the Republican Party were absolutely appalled. There were leaflets going all over, for example, the country saying that Richard Nixon was a traitor, Ronald Reagan was a traitor, he should never meet with a communist. A young congressman from Georgia, in the 6th district, named Newt Gingrich, said that essentially Reagan meeting with Gorbachev is tantamount to Neville Chamberlain meeting with Adolf Hitler. Jerry Falwell, Jesse Helms, they were all appalled. Ronald Reagan did get a treaty, did get the first treaty, did get the first, the INF treaty with the Soviet Union, with Democratic help, more so than Republicans. But that is certainly his views on the Russians. By the way, in 1976, Jimmy Carter, in many respects, although he had disagreements with Gerald Ford, when it came to the Soviet Union, he basically had the same position. He said that we should focus instead of North-South relations, and we should focus on human rights, as opposed to having everything about the United States versus Russia. And that was his foreign policy until Russia made that fatal mistake of invading Afghanistan.
Do you think, in retrospect, that Reagan's bellicose attitude towards Russia was in the long run better or not? On the one hand, things were easing, as you mentioned. Maybe they would have continued to ease, and the war in Afghanistan would have bled Russia dry economically anyway, without the bellicose and really dangerous actions and attitude of Reagan. Or on the other hand, was it Reagan's attitude and actions that brought down the Soviet Union? Either way, you would have had Afghanistan being there, Vietnam, or even worse. But Reagan did force them to spend a lot of, at least think that the United States was going to really spend, and that might have been a burden to the Soviet Union too. What do you think? Are we better off because of the way Reagan did it, or should they have continued to ease relations?
Well, there were two Reagans. There was the first term Reagan and the second term Reagan. The first term Reagan was the one that essentially wanted military buildup. He was the one who wanted the Strategic Defense Initiative, which would protect the United States from essentially, in terms of space, from Russia trying to invade us, which never passed the Congress at the time. There was that version of Ronald Reagan. Then there was a second term Ronald Reagan, which very much wanted to meet with Gorbachev, which wanted to actually have agreements with him. Ronald Reagan eventually became somewhat of a nuclear abolitionist in many respects. He said that we should try to get rid of nuclear weapons as opposed to just trying to limit nuclear weapons, which is what some of the strategic arm limitation treaties from the Nixon administration, SALT I, and then Strategic Arm Limitation Treaty, which President Carter began, but then eventually disbanded during his administration once Afghanistan was invaded by Russia. It's
What was
really
the
simple.
reason for the change? What was it, because of the change in leadership in Russia?
That's part of it. Remember, when Reagan came in, you had a couple of leaders who were only there for a couple of years, and they would essentially die. And Reagan would said essentially, Reagan said, "They keep dying on me. I can't actually meet with some of these people." But eventually, they did meet in Reykjavik with Gorbachev and Reagan. And Gorbachev is actually very much responsible for this too. And in part, you can say this is his failure, but he instituted policies in Russia to try to reform the system and allow more civil liberties. He had perestroika, for example, glasnost, which was all about opening up the Russian economy and decommunizing the country, if you will. And this helped to lead, certainly made Gorbachev an extremely unpopular person in Russia, to the point that when he left, his job approval was like 6%.
You can't do it that quickly. They didn't know how. Those people did not know how to operate in a capitalist way. They just didn't get it, and they couldn't thrive, and they hated him for it.
Oh, absolutely. And he became extremely unpopular. It's funny, when you talk about him in the United States, he's viewed almost as a demigod. You talk about him in Russia, specifically, if he said Gorbachev in around 1993, 1994, he would be absolutely vilified. Kind of like, I mean, he really has a different view here than he does certainly over there. But in terms of Ronald Reagan's legacy, I think it's very simplified to say simply Ronald Reagan won the Cold War. There were a lot of other factors. One of them you can certainly put in, for example, the Helsinki Conference, when the United States and other countries basically recognized the Soviet Union. You can put some of it, the détente policies. There's a lot of other things that you can essentially put into that pot. Now, did he contribute to it? Probably, but a lot of it was internal in the Soviet Union. And had, for example, Jimmy Carter been reelected in 1980 rather, would the policy would it essentially have been different? I don't know, but I'll say this: that in 1980, Jimmy Carter really began the policies that Reagan continued, and part of those was essentially getting tough with the Soviet Union, having a grain embargo, for example. So I think he perhaps needs some credit. I think President Ford needs some credit as well. The Helsinki Conference is kind of overlooked, but essentially that was where the United States and the Soviet Union made concessions at that point on civil rights. But Ronald Reagan said at the time they were putting a stamp on communism. That was one of the reasons he also, that in the Solzhenitsyn meeting, ran against Ford in 1976, which divided the Republican Party asunder and helped Jimmy Carter win the presidency in 1976.
Speaking of Gorbachev, one quick example of how quickly they were trying to change things. In 1990, my radio station, WBCN, I was involved in a promotion with Budweiser, because Budweiser wanted to be one of the, they wanted into Russia.
Oh, I bet.
They set up this big nationwide thing where four people in 25 markets in the U.S., 2 DJs and 2 listeners, would go to Moscow to see the Rolling Stones, another example of the West coming in there really quickly. And so we got to go, and we got to broadcast from all through Russia live.
That is amazing.
And it was interesting to see, on the one hand, there was a sense of hope. Wow, it's all changing. It's all, it's going to be just like America soon. That's the way we felt. There's McDonald's. It's just going to be a bunch of chain stores like us. But there was a sense that there was the old system and the new system, and you could feel it. It was chaos. It felt very chaotic. And then shortly after that, they had that Yeltsin coup thing.
Yes.
There was Yeltsin, and then that coup. And then it was all over. So we did get in there for that really brief window, and it's too bad. I guess it's too bad that they try to do it so quickly. And it's a lesson. You just can't go from communist to capitalist, because it takes a certain skill set to do, and people they didn't get it, and they didn't want to get it. They didn't want to have to work hard to get their money, I guess.
It's interesting. No, that is interesting. And I also think, though, that we use these terms, these kind of binary terms, communist and capitalist. Very rarely are forms of government actually completely communist or completely capitalist. For the most part, we have mixed economies. On the one hand, for example, in the United States, you have Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. that you could argue leads towards socialism. On the other hand, we have privatization on many things. So it's really kind of just like every other country, it's which way do you lean? And in the Soviet Union's case, in China's case, in Cuba's case, in Vietnam's case, in North Korea's case, they lean communist. In the United States, we lean capitalist.
Right.
But very rarely is a country have unfettered. For example, if we were completely privatized, complete libertarian society, then I think essentially every street would be private. For example, you would not have public roads because public roads is something the government provides.
Well, yes, if it was if there were truly no socialism in the U.S., every homeowner would have to have a missile in their own pool to defend themselves.
And fire, you'd take care of your own fires, that type of thing. Now people would argue when you make this argument, people on the right will say, yeah, those are different between social programs and socialism. And in many respects there is, but social programs generally lean toward the idea that you need to have a federal government, and the federal government essentially speaks for the people, and that's why, for example, everybody does not own their own road. But on
that seems like an arbitrary distinction, and that anything like Social Security is a social program, and the fire department is a social program. You put money into the pot, and it gets doled out by the government to do this social stuff. It's a weird, arbitrary, semantic distinction.
It is, and even in socialism, just like in capitalism, there are a litany of different views. On socialism, you have the Switzerland model, for example, which is a lot different than some of the more extreme models. You have what's called democratic socialism, which is what Martin Luther King and Bernie Sanders support, for example, which essentially says we lean towards socialism. But you know what? Under they're not really necessarily true socialists, because ask Bernie Sanders, okay, would you want to private? Then would you essentially allow the federal government to control the grocery store? And he's probably going to. My guess is he's probably going to say no.
Right.
He's going to say there are some things that need to be private. Or say, should the federal government set a certain amount? For example, price limits, a certain amount of money that everything should cost a certain amount of money, or that type of thing. And he probably is going to say no. He probably is going to say there should be some. There should be some private markets. There should be some free markets. I think even some of the most ardent socialists would say that. On the other side, libertarianism is probably the closest we have to true capitalism. Libertarianism is essentially the view that government is a limited purpose entity, but libertarianism also believes that there are certain functions that the government has. While limited, they do. Generally speaking, libertarians believe there should be fire, there should be police force, for example. Now, they might believe it should be very scaled down. They might believe some may say, well, we should have all volunteer firefighters. But in terms of the police force, they say, yes, we should have something there. We should have a prison system, for example. Only an anarchist, a complete anarchist, would be somebody who would say, I guess that would be, and it's funny with anarchy, you always hear anarchy as a left-wing movement, and people equate it, say, oh, it's the tantamount to socialist. Well, it's really more of a right-wing movement, because anarchy essentially would say, we don't trust the federal government. We don't think there should be a federal government. And that, I guess, would be a true capitalist system where you can put anything you want.
Wasn't that January 6th? Wasn't that anarchy?
I don't think you would make that. I don't think they would say they're anarchists because they wanted Donald Trump installed.
Yeah, but what they say is not high on my list of what's important.
But I think
wouldn't it be wouldn't that be anarchy? I'm just going to topple the system. That's what they wanted to do, break the system.
But they
wanted to overthrow the president-elect.
But their objective, though, so if they won and got everything they wanted, their objective, though, would not be to have an anarchist system. They would want Donald Trump to become president, and Donald Trump's policies are certainly not anarchy. For one thing, Donald Trump is very much an advocate of protective tariffs, for example, and under a true system of anarchy, you would be able to trade. Anyone would be able to trade with anybody from any country, and there would be no restrictions. You would have complete open borders, because the federal government should not be there to say we need to restrict this many people from coming in, for example. That's a complete anarchist system. There is no government whatsoever. Now, if you ask I think many anarchists would say what they would say, well, essentially, I think human beings can kind of rule themselves. We don't need the government there. as kind of an arbiter, but it's fascinating to me that anarchy and socialism are equated as somehow the same type of a movement, when in reality,
Right.
socialism wants an all-encompassing government. Anarchy literally wants no government at all.
Yeah. So when you get into humans can rule themselves, you get into an absolute might makes right situation,
You go
which
back to
is
the state of
which
nature.
is good if you have a lot of might, and bad if you don't.
Well,
Yeah.
if you go back to the time, if you go back, human beings were originally in the state of nature. Jacques-Jean Rousseau used to say essentially that humans were born free, but everywhere we're in chains. So John Locke and Thomas Hobbes talk about this idea of essentially there being a social contract. Thomas Hobbes said that the world was essentially that the natural human condition, the state of nature, is nasty, brutish, and short.
Yeah.
So what do they need? You need to have some sort of a government that people install. You give certain powers to the sovereign, and in turn, the sovereign provides you protection. But you have to give those powers to the sovereign, and part of those powers is giving up the idea of absolute freedom. That's John Locke had a very more positive view of the state of nature and a positive view of government. Thomas Hobbes was very much a realist, actually very similar, I think, to Henry Kissinger. I think you could put there some of how as being an ideological antecedent there, but we do all begin in the state of nature. And even if you look at other species, for example, every other species basically is in the state of nature because they do not have a government system. They may have essentially a chain. You look at birds, for example, they decide when they're going to come. Well, who's going to when they fly. When they go south, who's going to be first, who's going to be second, who's going to be third. But it's not an actual government. They're not actually voting for somebody or installing some sort of a dictator.
One side note on that.
On birds.
On all animals, it's shocking to me to realize, you look at a squirrel.
Yes.
Or a rabbit, anybody in the wild, they have no stuff. When they go somewhere, they don't even have a backpack. They don't have they have nothing, just nothing. And they go somewhere and they have to get food that day. It's crazy to think of. Imagine yourself with nothing, just your clothes, going out there. We have so much crap, and they have zero things. When they go from one place to another, zero.
And then you look at humans.
No toothbrush.
And humans literally can't survive 2 minutes without going on Facebook and looking at their phone, to the extent that when they're driving, they literally have to look at that, and then they have to see they have to start texting and doing that all while they're driving. And then you look at aardvarks, and aardvarks are able to essentially do everything to essentially live their lives without anything.
We certainly have gotten off track, which I think makes a good conversation.
From Henry Kissinger to aardvarks.
Yeah. So would R.I.P. Henry Kissinger for what, R.I.P. Henry Kissinger. One question before you go, or one observation. I do want to catch up on the upcoming elections and the polls and stuff. As you know, it is my stated view that Trump will not be the Republican nominee. Actually, I said neither DeSantis or Trump will be. And now I see Trump starting to do some things that I'm wondering if you think might actually hurt him, like really hurt him in the polls. For example, coming down, he seems to be going off the rails and even ignoring his advisors, talking about how he's going to get rid of Obamacare. And Obamacare is a popular program. Is he getting off the reservation enough so he's hurting himself significantly?
In the not necessarily in the Republican primary, but certainly in the general election.
Republicans are saying, other Republicans are concerned that is ammunition for the left.
Oh, absolutely.
And so they are less likely to want him to be the nominee.
I think this is this is one of those things that kind of makes you go, "Whom?" You really kind of be befuddled by it. It's it's a case you make if you're running as the conservative candidate in a Republican primary and you're at 7%. You're trying to effectuate your bona fides for conservatism. Yes, you take that position. If you go back to 2010 in the midterm elections, even Democrats, many of them were saying, "I don't like Obamacare." Obamacare was not particularly popular and actually passed. It literally passed by one vote.
Yeah, but people like it now. They got used to it.
Now it's popular, not in the Republican primary necessarily, but you go to the general election and he's giving ammunition to Joe Biden or whoever the Democratic presidential nominee is to say, he was essentially he was against Obamacare. You see, he uses the term Obamacare specifically as opposed to the Affordable Care Act.
Right.
That's a word game because as soon as you mention a word like Barack Obama or Joe Biden, when you talk about Joe Biden, you don't talk about, for example, Joe Biden's economic plan. You don't talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. You say the word Joe Biden because in both cases, they're a watchword among Republicans. And as soon as you get a visceral reaction that's going to be deleterious, it's going to be negative toward Democrats. And I think Trump certainly knows what he's doing in that respect. But I don't know what it shows about him because he's certainly so far ahead. He can run in a front runner strategy.
I think that even conservatives and Republicans and even Christian right, they like a lot of the healthcare now, and they won't admit it if there's a microphone around, and they might not tell it to a pollster, but they don't want their healthcare taken away, and there is no plan. There has been no alternative plan put in place. So I'm thinking, and the other thing is, huge donor conglomerations are turning away from Trump now. And recently we had one endorse Nikki Haley and going to spend huge amounts of money on Nikki Haley. And when other big donors see the alpha donor going that way, they go that way too. Do you think we'll start to see a surge for Nikki Haley?
You're seeing it right now because she's becoming the essential alternative to Donald Trump. Ron DeSantis is very much underperformed. Ron DeSantis, a lot of these same people, probably the Koch network, they very much support his reelection campaign as governor in 2022. They thought that Ron DeSantis was going to be the alternative. There were polls a year ago from now showing that he was very, very formidable candidate. Now you even look in New Hampshire, and Chris Christie is actually ahead of him. I saw a poll showing him at 8% now. So they're looking for an alternative. They figured Chris Christie's not going to get the nomination because he's too anti-Trump. So saying who's the only alternative, and Nikki Haley is the only game in town because she's in second place, and she's really the only person who has somewhat of a chance of upending Donald Trump, or at least being formidable and going all the way to the convention. So that's why I think folks like the Koch network, who is very much anti-Trump, is supporting her. And you listen to Donald Trump's response in Trump campaign, they immediately say, well, the Koch brothers are essentially rhinos because they're more libertarians. And he says they support open borders. So he's trying to make the case that they are that these are liberals who are supporting Nikki Haley.
But the money talks, and they'll bring in more money. So Nikki Haley, I mean, she's got a lot going on for her now. And if she goes into New Hampshire and exceeds expectation, momentum goes her way, I can see the dominoes. I can see the Jenga blocks falling out from underneath Donald Trump. Hey, we skipped over a question. Phil Cate asked if we'd ever heard what Anthony Bourdain said about Kissinger. I have not. Can you post up what the answer is to that? We're both looking forward to seeing that. It's interesting. I've been watching a lot of Anthony Bourdain videos lately, so I am curious about it. Here we go. He says, boom. Once you've been to Cambodia, you'll never stop wanting to beat Henry Kissinger to death with your bare hands. Well, that's interesting, yeah. And that sounds very much like Anthony Bourdain. He didn't pull any punches. Anything else you want to mention about Henry before we go? I have a headache because I haven't eaten anything. I got to get some food.
I'll go back where I started, and that's the word bifurcated. That's the one thing you're going to hear about his legacy. And here's the divide. I talked about the divide in the Republican Party, in the Democratic Party. Bill Clinton and Joe Biden released statements praising Henry Kissinger. Okay, so the establishment of the Democratic Party very much praises him. Madeleine Albright and John Kerry, for example, would often appear with him. Now, on the other side of that, people that are actually on the left wing of the Democratic Party would be very antithetical to anything that they believe to actually praise Henry Kissinger. They believe this man is a tyrant. They believe that he is evil. It's similar to the divide in the Vietnam War, where there were folks like the Johnson-Humphrey administration and some of their coefficients who supported their policy in Vietnam. Then you have people on the left who are protesting him, saying, "Hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" I'd love to hear, for example, Joe Biden or Bill Clinton what they would say to the left wing criticisms of Henry Kissinger. But they were people who were very much allied with him, even though they disagree with him on some things. This is the divide. This is the chasm or the schism that puts the Democratic Party, at least in foreign policy, I think, asunder. And I remember in one debate, Bernie Sanders basically excoriated Hillary Clinton back in 2016 because Hillary Clinton had praised Henry Kissinger in the past.
Okay. Phil Kate also gives us Santos is out.
Yes, but he's got a new job. I actually heard he's applying for one.
Here comes the joke.
That, yeah, well, not a joke, but actually, the Baruch College volleyball team is needing a new coach. And since he was such a great volleyball player back then, I think he would really do a great job. Now he's got experience in Congress. I think he'd do a great job, and he can mentor these young people and talk about his own experience playing volleyball for our championship team at Baruch College.
Yeah, I'm actually sad to see Santos go because he was so obviously messed up. It was plain for everybody to see, and I don't think he's the only one in there messed up. Sandra Day O'Connor died at 93. Okay, well, this is wonderful. Thank you very much. Rich Rubino, political historian and commenter, always super interesting. Rich is gaining traction as a commenter in big-time media, right?
Yep.
In addition to doing your local in-person talks, you've been on some larger news outlets. Tell me about that.
Yep, I was on News Nation about an hour ago talking about Sandra Day O'Connor's death, and I've been on Scripps as well. I was talking about Rosalind Carter's death and talking about Henry Kissinger's death, so doing the television circuit.
Right. Beautiful. Well, keep up the good work, and I'll do whatever I can to make you a superstar. Remember the little people when you're huge.
I will. I'll remember. I think I'm going to actually get George Santos to mentor me too, because I'm sure he's got a great career ahead of him.
Yeah, I wonder. I'm going to stop it there. We can do George Santos another day. Thank you very much, and I look forward to speaking with you again.
Categorically.
Phil, thank you very much for your support. That is it. Bye now.